Welcome to the Wide Lens podcast, where expanding your perspective on recent history is our mission. Listen to untold accounts from overlooked voices and see familiar stories in a whole new light. Ready to dive deeper? Let's begin.
Hey, everybody. On this episode of the Wide Lens podcast, we're honored to welcome a retired naval officer, Per Provencher. Across more than 2 decades of service, Per found himself at the crossroads of some of the most consequential military moments of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. From escorting tankers during the tense final chapters of the Iran-Iraq conflict, to serving aboard carriers during the Gulf War, to standing watch in the Pacific as the world reeled from 9/11, Per's career offers a rare firsthand look at the global events that shaped a generation. But his story isn't just about deployments and operations, it's about the unseen decisions, the quiet professionalism, and the lived reality of service members who carry out missions that rarely make headlines. From nuclear shipyards to forward deployed command ships in Japan, Per's experiences reveal the complexity, pressure, and humanity behind the uniform. Today, we'll explore the full arc of his journey, the conflicts he served in, the moments that defined him, the responsibilities he shouldered, and the lessons he carried forward. We'll also look at the work he's doing now and the perspective he brings to a world still shaped by the events he witnessed up close. Per, welcome to the Wide Lens podcast. It's a real privilege to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great being here.
Per, just honestly, knowing that you were going to be coming on the show, that we could chat through these monumental elements in history, I was just personally floored and excited because it's incredibly prolific, the different experiences and the different historical moments you were a part of and that you witnessed. So I've been waiting for this day. I've been waiting for this interview. I'm really excited, and I'm sure that folks that are listening in are going to really enjoy hearing your experience through all of these really life-changing moments in our history.
It seems pretty common for a lot of my compatriots, but let's go ahead.
Awesome. Well, Per, what we're going to do is we're going to just start off to kind of like dig into your early life and the foundations that really brought you to this conversation today. And it's storied and it's deep. And so the first question I've got is we're going back to little Per. When you were a little guy, where did your interest in military service first begin? Where did that come from, Per?
Well, it's kind of an odd story. My whole family was Army, and my neighbor was an Army recruiter, and so I had looked at that when I was in high school. My stepfather was in the Navy, and so that kind of drew some interest. But I was literally during high school, I did an internship at Boeing, and then I also did a half-time in high school, half-time as an electronic technician at a local community college. And while I was there, I literally picked up a brochure about, hey, join the Navy. And I went, well, I should take a look at that. And when I was able to transfer over from North Seattle College to University of Washington, I was looking to get into the electrical engineering program. I literally just walked in to the ROTC office and said, hey, can I take classes? And they went, sure, anybody can sign up. And then one of the instructors said, are you just sort of interested? And I said, well, yeah, I have some interest. And he put an application in front of me. And I went, okay. And, no scholarship. It was just all voluntary. And then I got very motivated about it and was able to earn the local professor of naval studies, the CEO of the RTC unit, actually had a scholarship to give that was locally controlled, and I was able to get it. And so I got into the scholarship program, and off I went.
So in a way, it was like an intentional stumbling into the Navy. What did your parents think about this? Were they a bit surprised by it?
Not particularly. My my mother had served in another army, in the Royal Danish Army, because all citizens had to do some sort of public service, and her only question was, "Do you know what you're getting into?" And this is, you're writing a check, up to your life that might get cashed. And I went, "Yeah, I understand." And it sounded interesting, so off I went.
I'm also Scandinavian. I'm largely Norwegian, got a little bit of Swede in me and then some Finnish too. And the Danes are famous, pair, for being pretty peace-loving folks. Did your mom, was she a bit nervous about that because of the historic conflicts that the US has been in really for the last 100 years? Did that like cultural difference, did that matter to her at all?
Not particularly, although it was Navy, not Army. Strangely enough, here's just a rando sort of tangent. My I had scored pretty well on the ASVAB, so my neighbor, the recruiter, the Army recruiter, actually had me set up for a couple of different, potential jobs in the Army, and one of them was, and you can't make this up, is atomic demolition specialist. So, because we actually had a group of people who specialized in that area, so, the road not taken.
Yeah, absolutely. Does UW, does it have like an atomic engineering program, a nuclear program?
At the time, it did have a nuclear engineering program. You would walk by a little one-story building, and you'd look at the sign, and it said nuclear reactor building. They had a small research reactor. Now, it was shut down and torn down and greenfielded and cleaned up, and there's another building on the site, but yeah, they did at the time.
Just a little plug for one of the other best engineering schools on the West Coast, and that's my alma mater, Oregon State. We still have a nuclear reactor on
Mhm,
campus, and so we have state police there at all times to protect it. So it's a big engineering school, just like
mhm.
the Huskies, and we're still going at it and building, doing a lot of nuclear work there. So Per, would you say there was like a defining moment or really like, I mean, you touched on this already to some degree, but was there like a real influence that led you to decide to be in the Navy? Like, why there's so many branches of the military. Were you like a big Top Gun fan or something? Like, why the Navy? And did anyone or anything influence you into that?
Well, Top Gun was actually by the almost right when I was graduating. So I was already in by then, but literally, I was at a community college, and I was finishing up. I was in high school, and I had this sort of half a day program, and I just wandered over to the registrar and said, "Hey, if I wanted to keep taking classes here to maybe transfer, I'm a high school student here, what would I have to do?" And the little old lady in tennis shoes who run most bureaucracies just looked at me and said, "You're a student here. You just have to pay." So, and at her desk was a little folder with brochures. So while I'm waiting for her to process the paperwork, I picked up the Navy brochure. That was literally it.
Awesome. Well, Per, I'm a marketeer as well, and so it's neat to see that a brochure placement actually worked with someone. So it's encouraging to hear.
Yeah, that was a pretty effective trifold. It got me in for 28 years.
I love it. Yeah, they got their printing money back from that one. Hey, so just digging into like really how it all started when you were getting into the Navy. I know that you were a part of the midshipman exchange program and an exchange student at the Japanese Defense Academy. Tell us a little bit about that. How did you get introduced to that? Why did you decide that's something that you wanted to do? And how did that shape your experiences moving forward? Tell us a little bit about that time.
So I'd mentioned I was, I'd been a electronics draftsman. I'd actually competed in some competitions. That's what I did in high school, and then I had sort of a computer internship at Boeing, and then I did a electronics technician program, certificate program while I was in high school at North Seattle College. So I'm revved up, ready to go, transfer to UW, and then strangely enough, a article about electrical engineering appears in U.S. News and World Report about how it's the greatest thing ever. And they went from interviewing students, and my GPA was pretty good, and I thought I would be pretty strong in interview because I had a bunch of background. And I went to see the counselor for the EE program right before I was going to apply for it, and they went, "We have so many applications. I'm literally going to throw them out the window and look at the ones that are face up." And I went, "Really?" And he went, "No, we're just going to go straight GPA." And at the time, they also had a quota system, and he said, "You're good for mechanical engineering and ceramic engineering." UW had a program, they were working with the space shuttle on ceramics, but not for EE, but come back next year. And I went, "I can't come back next year. I'm on this Navy scholarship." And so I bailed out to my minors because I had to get a degree. And the Navy is pretty technical. So, but there are English majors and philosophy majors and such. And I was minoring in Asian languages and literature because it was just interesting to me, Japanese, Korean, Chinese. And so I'd taken a bunch of Japanese. And the Navy has a program where they have exchange students both into the Naval Academy and also out to other academies. And there are 2 slots for the Naval Academy and 1 slot for all of the ROTCs. And UW is one of the original Japanese language colleges pre-World War II. We generally pick that slot up fairly often. And in the year before we had, and so I applied and got it. And so for my first class cruise, when normally over the summer you would go to a ship and be an assistant to a junior officer, they sent me to Bodai Gakko, which is the Japanese Tri-Service Academy. They have a single academy for all their services, and for 2 years you do sort of generic things, and then for the last 2 years you specialize in ground, air, or naval. And it was different because literally my orders were to report to the naval attaché in Tokyo, and then they literally hand you off to the Japanese, and away you go. And it was sort of profoundly sort of changing for me.
Were you able to make any, like, close connections with anyone specifically, or were you hanging out with the Americans mostly? Did you get any, like, cross-cultural engagement in that at all, Pair?
Well, the Americans were 3 of us, so there weren't a lot. Now they dormed us together in the barracks, and but sort of our deeper connection was from later. We'll talk about when we get to when I was stationed in Japan, where the lovely Mrs. P taught English, and one of her students is now is a senator in the Japanese Diet. So they still correspond. In fact, her son's been over, and they're coming over next year here probably to visit. So yeah, there's been some connections, but not from the time in the academy because everyone's sort of scattered to the winds.
So when you were doing this was about 40 to 50 years after World War II when this was happening for you, meaning that there were still folks, they were, older, but there were folks all across Japan that had experienced and were involved in World War II. And of course, in the Asian theater, Japan was our greatest rival. And we were dead set enemies against Japan in the 40s. And now it's in the 80s now. And you're there engaging with them. Did any of that come up at all, or was that something that kind of like people just kind of pushed back to the side? Pair, what did that look like? Was there any, we were massive allies with Japan at this point, and we were still in the Cold War, so they were an incredibly important partner. But did any of that history, did it ever bubble up at all?
I mean, it was evident. I mean, and many of the people that I'd studied very closely, World War II. And remember, this was right about the time when Japanese leadership was just starting to both simultaneously acknowledge some of the pretty bad things that the armed forces had done in China, in the Philippines, and elsewhere. But it was also starting to acknowledge that history is history, and it can't be ignored. It has to be acknowledged. So I wouldn't say in a negative way, but it certainly was evident. There were people who collected memorabilia, but that's not to be confused with sort of actively promoting, any kind of militaristic. Remember at the time, even today, the 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 Japanese air, uh, ground, and naval are self-defense forces, and they don't have that sort of. They've specifically thought to limit their offensive capability because there's certainly memory is long.
Yeah.
But
Are they, am I wrong, Per, in thinking that there's like a little bit of a movement in that reality though? Like aren't they softening to that a little bit in Japan? Are they opening up a little bit of a fence?
Well, they certainly are. A country with F-15s and Aegis destroyers and submarines and a very capable military, and certainly given it's a tough neighborhood, but certainly something like sending a ship on a training cruise to Hawaii is a pretty big deal. While the U.S. Navy, that's kind of Tuesday. So yeah, public opinion's kind of moved on that a bit. I think they're still struggling with that a little bit.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. So moving on from that, pair, something that maybe a lot of folks really haven't heard too much about, but you kind of like really just jumped into the mix of things and you were part of the tanker war and Operation Earnest Will. And this was, if we go back to it, this is about 1989, if I'm correct. And I don't think a lot of folks really know a lot about the history and the geopolitical context for the tanker wars. So can you just kind of give us a little update about what this was, what was going on, why were we involved, and why were you involved? What were you up to?
So this is the tail end of the Iran-Iraq War, which was September 1980 to to 88, and the war where Henry Kissinger said, "Is it possible for both sides to lose?" Where very bloody conflict between two countries that was costly to both, and a very ugly conflict. But it was an ugly conflict, astride the oil pipelines to Europe and Asia. And, Iraq attacked Karg Island and Iran attacked their oil capabilities. And in the middle of all this, we had always had a small contingent, one ship, and the British had sometimes had a ship. But Iran and Iraq were actively targeting each other's oil exports. And as you may know, the American merchant marine is practically nothing. So they're all foreign flagged ships. But this is a significant issue, and and this might sound familiar. Iran, which sits astride the Straits of Hormuz, what actually started making claims to will shut down the strait. Now, they didn't have a port on outside the strait, so it was sort of bad for both of them. They would still need to be able to push their own through, but they had small boat attacks. They had a small navy. They had anti-ship missiles they were throwing at ships, and more than 100 ships were attacked, and also by air. And also the context of this is one of our, if you might recall, the USS Stark was mistakenly attacked by the Iraqis. In fact, the story is when the pilot landed and said, "Hey, I think I just blew up a Iranian tanker," he was arrested, saying, "No, you didn't. You just attacked an American frigate."
Mm,
37 sailors died, and that caused a reprisal. and Iraq eventually apologized and paid compensation for that. But we had always had a small patrol there, and the UN was trying to stop the conflict, and Kuwait, which had a large tanker fleet, actually came up with an idea. Why don't we reflag a bunch of our tankers because they were tired of getting their tankers attacked, reflag them as U.S. tankers, and then the U.S. would have a legal and moral obligation to protect them against all attacks.
That's clever.
And Kuwait just wanted their product to get through. They hadn't taken a side on the conflict.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the Navy went, gee, that's kind of interesting. And it was negotiated and we did it. So I think it was the Al Kafar was renamed the motor vessel Bridgeton, and things like that happened. And as a business that we had not been in for a while, although we exclusively trained for, I mean, part of the superpower confrontation in Europe was an expectation that we would convoy troops and equipment to Europe to sort of face down the Soviet bear. So we certainly had some skill in convoys, but we hadn't certainly done it in sort of this way. And so a active convoy procedure started. And that's a little weird for us because I was on a destroyer that was in the Pacific Fleet Anti-Submarine Squadron, where we practiced and we were specifically optimized for going out and finding our Soviet friends who were lurking off the coast. So we were highly optimized in training and equipment for that. And then all of a sudden we were told, move all that equipment off. We need you to go to the Gulf.
Mm.
And so it was sort of a right-hand turn for us, and we started basically convoy training and preparing for that.
Goodness. So this is going to parlay into the Gulf War. For folks that don't know this, Per was referencing Kuwait, and Kuwait's a really small nation. It's a sovereign nation. It's right next to Iraq, and even though it's really, really small, Per, if, am I right in thinking it's just absolutely packed filled with oil fields? So
Right.
it has a lot of wealth in it, and as you said, Kuwait is like, hey, we're not basically gonna pick a dog in the fight of Iran versus Iraq. We just want to export our oil and develop our country in a sovereign way. Is that right?
Right. It was a small island nation, but it was in the interior of the Persian Gulf, so it had to get its oil out.
Mhm. Mhm. And what do you think about, I mean, what do you think it's just really interesting because when we were sharing, like, some of the things that we wanted to cover, we were talking a bit about this, and now, of course, we're in the midst of an Iranian conflict with the United States, and this very strait is incredibly a hot button issue because commercial vessels are being targeted, and now the U.S. is threatening to destroy some power plants if the strait isn't held open. You saw, like, the tension within this area and how there's, like, this pressure point, this location that if it is closed off, it impacts the entire global economy. So, are you surprised at all, Per, of what we're seeing today and how there's so much all the conflict is reaching this exact same point that you were working in back in the day?
Well, the sort of economic facts are very similar. 20% of the world's oil passes through that place, and what's a little different is there are now pipelines for both Saudi Arabia and others to sort of avoid the strait, but but a big part of it was getting through there, and I think the key difference is at the time in the tanker war, it was the Iran-Iraq war had been going for 7 years, and they were attacking each other and actively lobbying missiles. Hey, I think that's one of yours, and small boat attacks and missile attacks, some air attacks. And what's different now is just the threat of, and then eventually mining, but just the threat of mining. The sort of center of gravity wasn't mines in the Gulf. The center of gravity was the insurance company
Mm,
saying, "I will no longer insure your vessel
mm.
because it's too dangerous." That's a little different, but yeah, a lot of similarities. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah, exactly. It was interesting. I was having a conversation a couple of days ago, and someone said to me, they said, "Hey, well, Brad, most of our oil is domestic," and they reiterated your point about that 20% of oil is coming out of the Middle East. So, what's the big deal? We're fine. We're going to be okay. And just to remind folks, I've got a degree in international business that we live in a global economy,
Mhm.
and so when we see oil insecurity in the Middle East, it directly affects the price of a barrel of oil across the entire planet. It is a global commodity. And so anything that is causing any issues around the oil trade, regardless of where you're accessing it yourself, you're going to see spikes or insecurity in oil in your own backyard, even if you yourself are not consuming that oil as a country, i.e., the United States. We're impacted by it because it is a global commodity. So that's something that I guess is a bit surprising for folks, but that's why the Middle East is so relevant, because we do run off oil, and whatever happens there impacts economies, doesn't it?
It's part of a, highly networked global economy. If a ship gets sideways in the Suez Canal and blocks it, or if there's a threat in the Strait of Malacca, or any of our major sort of thoroughfares, it ripples across the whole globe.
Absolutely. So, how about you, Pear? Did you ever, when you were in the midst of these tanker wars, did you ever feel the tension of a potential engagement with Iranian forces? Tell us a little bit about that. Did your blood pressure ever increase a bit during this time?
Well, it did. Remember, the context is we had just had, back in, it was May of '87. We deployed in September of '88, but we had had the USS Stark hit by two Exocets, mistakenly fired by the Iraqis, by an Iraqi French Mirage. Killed 37 sailors, and it was only through, miraculous effort that they saved the ship. Similar attacks on the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy had sunk ships in the Falklands. Our damage control school is now named after the CEO of the ship, the Paul X. Rinn School. Just miraculous. Little aside, when I was later on in in damage control school, before I was going to one of the carriers, is they actually gave us the problem set, the messages from the Stark, and one of them was, we tried to enter the compartment to fight the fire, but there was 12 inches of boiling water in it, which was, something that hadn't really been thought about. How do you deal with, because the fire was so hot, it was boiling the firefighting water. And
Unbelievable.
we recognized, hey, this scenario is the Stark, but so we're getting ready to deploy for that, and our captain, Cutler Dawson, very interesting man. He had command early as a lieutenant, and then as on a minesweeper. Then he had command of a small frigate as a lieutenant commander, and as a commander, this was his third command. So very. Then later he commanded a cruiser, and then eventually retired as a 3-star third fleet, and then went on to run Navy Federal Credit Union, strangely enough. But he actually addressed it directly. And once we had left port, so it was private. This was prior to email or any of those things. We just
Sure.
had good old fashioned snail mail. Is he just addressed the whole crew and said, "Hey, listen, the the Stark got hit and all those sailors died, and it was an accident, but I'm not letting that happen to us.
Mm. How's
I'm
he gonna
not going to let that happen to us
how can he be so bold in saying that? How can he stop that?
because the sort of peacetime mentality, the Stark had the capability to shoot the archer and to shoot the arrow,
Okay.
and they failed.
Right.
So miraculous, heroic
Would you say they failed,
damage control.
Per, would you say they failed though because it was kind of like it was a mistake by the sounds of it? It was a bit out of the blue, and so sadly that the destruction of that ship meant that you guys were like proactively prepared for the same thing.
So, sort of in the larger scale, I would say, but again, one of the downsides of a long period of peace is that sort of confirmation bias. Even though you're in the Gulf with an active fighting war happening around you,
Around you. Yep.
and and we're a U.S. Navy ship, not one of your targets, but they're firing, on almost everything else, and not recognizing that that aircraft was an attack profile,
Mhm.
and defensive actions that should have happened did not. I mean, like I mentioned, the damage control effort was absolutely, absolutely heroic.
Yeah.
But but the actions might have been different to defend the ship, because literally it's a warship in a war zone, and a lot of things changed after that. This was sort of another sort of Pearl Harbor moment, or maybe even a 9/11 moment, where where complacency and thinking about what precisely you had to do. Now the damage control training kicked in, but not being on a defensive posture and not realizing, hey, this aircraft coming towards us looks like he's on an attack run.
Mm,
They might not know who we are. Let's talk
mm,
to them and tell them. And it
mm,
turns out later, I was the tactical communicator, and we had a well-established script. In fact, I remember, I know it to this day. I won't repeat it. Where there were a series of warnings that start with, "Hey, we're us. Just letting you know who we are." All the way up to, you are subject to U.S. defensive measures, which is a polite
mhm.
a polite way to say, stop what you're doing, turn outbound, or we're gonna shoot you.
Yeah. I mean, that's a politest way to be able to say it. I mean, it sounds like it's like, "Man, we don't wanna do this, but you're really leaving us no choice here."
Right, because remember in the tanker war, we were neutral.
Mhm.
I mean, we had engaged with the UN to try to bring a ceasefire, but we didn't take either side,
Yeah.
and our escorting, the whole manner of the tanker war was we're escorting tankers that maybe a month ago weren't, but today they're flying an American flag, have an American name, and we have a legal and moral obligation to protect them from
Mhm.
any attack from any taker.
That's
But
right.
to answer your question directly, yeah, we were thinking a lot about that. Our XO, or second in command, the executive officer, had been the naval assistant to the commandant of the Marine Corps, so he had a lot of connections, and he got special training. We actually had a boarding party that got some special infantry training, and he also did something else. He had dog tags made for all of us, because one of the issues with the Stark was identifying the very burnt bodies, and that was not gonna be an issue because it wasn't something that was a normal thing for shipboard personnel to have, metal dog tags.
That's pretty sobering. Did they communicate the rationale and reasoning why you're getting those dog tags, or did you just basically
Didn't have to.
Yeah, yeah.
Everyone knew exactly the reason.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So, you're saying that, back in the late '80s, early '90s, we didn't really have a lot of different communications, and so you're sending snail mail, sending post, and that's the only way to really do it. Were you able to communicate back to your family back in the US and say like, "Hey, this is what's going on. This is this is what ship I'm on, I'm doing all right? Or were they seeing this stuff on CNN? They knew you were in the general area, but they didn't know where you actually were, what you were doing. What did communication look like, Per, for you back home at that
Well,
time?
well, well, ships have a lot of communications, but in terms of the sort of personal
Yeah,
communications,
personal.
it was writing a letter or postcard, and then just sort of a very mechanical thing is at the time the Middle East was sort of halfway between the fleets. We had the Atlantic Fleet and the Pacific Fleet, and we actually had trouble. We people would number their mails and date them and number them so you would know when they came out of order and what the latest mail I had received from you, so the conversation was a little more cogent. Like, "What do you mean the car broke down?" Hadn't heard that yet, and it turns out it was a physical piece of mail. When you're underway, we had a helicopter, and you could helicopter if we were within range of the carrier, and then the carrier would transfer it. But that mailbag was golden cargo. And if you did a underway replenishment where we come alongside another ship and we transfer goods, one of the things that was transferred that was carefully watched was the mailbag. Because the mailbag slipping off the pallet and ending up in the water was a disaster.
Mm, mm.
But as it turns out, we had a big break in our mail because in that transition between fleets, instead of the mail heading east across the Pacific, our mail started headed west across the Atlantic,
Right.
and so the all kinds of mail got all, way out of order. But, things are different now, but it was literally, you know, postcards and letters. And
Per, I've done work with countries. I've been to many countries myself and worked with colleagues from all over the world, and I know exactly what you're talking about. Like from us here on the West Coast, like Sri Lanka, India, that area, that is the other side of the planet, and sometimes you got to just scratch your head and say, like, how am I going to get over there? I'm going to go west. I'm going to go east. I'm not sure, but that's right. It's like when you're on the opposite side, it's a bit of a choice on how you're going to do that. So,
then there was good
were
old-fashioned telephones.
were they worried about that mail, like, falling into the drink because they're like, "This is gonna, like, hurt morale and people need to be connecting with each other," or were they worried, like, "These are, like, some of our like, we can't let the enemy, Iran or Iraq, see what's going on and how our folks are really feeling about things." Why were folks so nervous about losing, that golden precious cargo?
Because it's your connection. And not to mention, this is previous to direct deposit. So this was back in the Bronze Age time where pay was often in cash,
Mhm.
and and I was responsible for many things, many dangerous things. But my good friend, the dispersing officer, before deployment, actually had to go to a bank, withdraw several $1 million in cash, and under armed guard, get back to the ship and put it in his safe. There was actually a dispersant officer that was killed many years ago, and because you were paid in cash, and then the long line would go to the post office. We had a small post office, and you would make you would cut what were they called? I've already forgotten what they're called. A mail order check, and those would be mailed home. And that's how your spouse or your girlfriend or your family, anyone you were supporting, got the money. So that mailbag literally was gold.
Mm, mm, that's a
And
good
it was only later that the Navy went to, this is ridiculous for all kinds of reasons, went to mandatory direct deposit.
mm, mm. So, Per, when you're on that naval ship, how much does the Navy care about it, even though you're doing stuff where you're escorting US and Kuwaiti flag ships, right? You're escorting them, you're trying to keep that oil going. How much are they worried about kind of trying to keep you guys feeling normal? And do they give you any space to, like, have fun on the ships? Is there, like, a little movie theater in there? Can you play some ping pong? What do you guys do just to kind of pass the time and also to to make light of a pretty stressful situation. Is there anything you guys do to help along those lines?
Well, one underway, you don't have any time.
Okay.
So we were just transitioning from good old fashioned film to sort of VHS, but watching an hour movie would have been an incredible luxury. I was a junior officer qualifying, so I was 6 on, 6 off, port and starboard. So, I'd watch from 6 in the morning to noon, then I would have to do my job, and then I had watch from 6 at night to midnight, I had to do my job, and then maybe get some sleep. So, and then even more than that, while we were doing the escorts through the Gulf, it was mandatory general quarters because literally we were underneath. There's Bandar Abbas is a city on the northern edge of the strait, and the Strait of Hormuz is actually a small island called Hormuz that's named after, and there's a series of cliffs up above that, and that's where the Iranians had mounted their missile batteries. So we were literally underneath their missile batteries, you know, you know, being watched. And so we were at general quarters the entire time. So our maximum state of readiness, and our schedule was more or less 2 weeks patrolling or doing earnest will missions in, out. We would collect all the tankers, escort them out, hand them off to there was a carrier strike group or battle group at the time that was out in the North Arabian Sea or the Gulf of Oman, the GU, and pick up the next group and bring them in. And then we would also patrol in the Gulf for freedom of navigation patrols. Iran had closed off a piece of the Gulf, stating it was their territory. And part of the sort of free flow of trade was if you declare an area of the ocean yours and nobody challenges it, you could make a claim that it must be ours.
Hmm.
So they had sort of the same thing that Libya did with their line of death was, we're claiming this part for us. And so we would literally carefully navigate, cross over the line, spend some time cutting circles, document that we did, and then head back over the line because that establishes the right of free passage.
Absolutely.
And so 2 weeks of that and earnest will missions, usually 2 days in Bahrain. There was a small Navy establishment there with a little store, and we could refuel. We could get fresh food. They had a Baskin Robbins with 3 flavors, which was funny
Yeah,
because the sign was 31 flavors, and the person just crossed out the one.
that's hilarious. So, Per, I don't know if you know this, but Baskin Robbins, I think the guy who started it, just like you, he's a UW graduate and started out of Tacoma, Washington. That's where Baskin Robbins is from. So all the
Go
way back.
figure.
Yeah, pretty cool. Lots of good things out of Tacoma.
But
Okay.
we learned all kinds of interesting things. I'm sure you're going to ask about.
Yeah, for sure. So, Per, which by the way, I went and saw that. I don't know if you've seen that, if you even plan to see that Project Hail Mary movie. I saw that a couple days ago and it was good. I would give it a 9.5 out of 10. I just loved it. But while I was watching it, I was sitting there and there was a trailer for the movie Dune, like one of the Dunes, it's like Dune 3 or Dune 4 or whatever it is. And I was like, this is so cool. I am sitting off of Ruston Way, right next to in a movie theater, right next to Dune Park, named after the fella from Tacoma who wrote the Dune films. I was like, who gets to do that? Gets to see a trailer for a movie, and there's Dune Park right next to you, and it's the same area that this guy who wrote the books grew up in. There's so many fun things that happen within a city.
Go figure.
Go figure. Go figure. Okay, so basically, hindsight's 2020. Perry doesn't know this yet, but he signed up on the dotted line and headed over to the Middle East. And he's thinking, okay, I'm just working on this escort service with the tanker wars, and we got 2 countries fighting each other. And then what happens? We've got Iraq attacking and invading Kuwait, our ally, And I'm sure there's probably things written down on paper that says, hey, when a country attacks Kuwait, we got to do something about it. We're probably held just kind of like the Brits were held when the Germans attacked Poland, bringing them into the war. I'm sure we were forced, our hand was forced at this point to engage. And so you're basically doing this work to keep the economies flowing. And then, bam, Iraq attacks and invades Kuwait. Now we're in the Gulf War. So this is 1991, and you're on the USS Nimitz. And tell us about that. What happened, and how was this whole thing unfolding? What did this look like for you when you're like, goodness, we were basically a third party, and now we're at war? What's happening here? Tell us a bit about that, Per.
Quite one, we like was mentioned, a third party sort of protecting a free trade international maritime route. And then sort of a flashback, even the first time en route, you get briefings on the area because we had spent the entire time knowing every little nook and cranny in the Pacific, looking for our Soviet friends and dealing with them. And so, you know, in Pearl Harbor, particularly in Hawaii, we got an extensive brief on the area. And I recall to this day, one of the briefings was, and I won't talk about the other pieces, was here are like 10 different ways a war could start in the Middle East. And way down at the bottom was little known thing that Saddam Hussein had a claim on Kuwait as a province of Iraq, a longstanding claim that everyone just sort of, nah, that's not a thing. But he always had it. So that was sort of the cause belli. The stated reason was, we're just reclaiming one of our old provinces, which is strangely apropos in the Pacific with Taiwan, strangely enough.
Or wait,
And,
same thing
and
happened. This is Per, this is exactly what's going on with Ukraine, right? It's that,
yeah,
yeah, that area that they say historically that's ours, right?
yeah, and it's Russian speaking, so
Mhm,
so the construction of Ukraine was somehow flawed, but
mhm.
substantial, you know, sort of global difference. Because our other friends in the Middle East, obviously, particularly Saudi Arabia, uh, you know, large oil riches, but a very modest military, and not necessarily our closest ally, but looking carefully at this juggernaut that had just rolled over Kuwait and was sitting on the border, ready to go, and and Saudi Arabia would not have been able to, in most people's estimations, would not have been able to put up any long resistance.
Did they
And
not have that because they basically saw the US as an ally? So they said, we don't really need to invest in military because we've got the US to protect us?
that perhaps was part of it, but just look at the populations. Iran and Iraq are long-standing nations with thousands of years of history.
That's right.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia was sort of recently constituted, nomadic tribes, not a large population. They just weren't sort of a peer military, and the fact that oil was discovered and there's a great deal of wealth there doesn't change the fact that you've got a large piece of territory that's mostly empty, and and modern armor combined assault would have rolled in, and they would have had significant difficulties. I mean, the Kuwaitis fought bravely, but were just vastly outnumbered, and Kuwait fell pretty quickly. But obviously, the famous, this shall not stand. But
That's
uh,
referencing the aggression, right?
the aggression, and well, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
And there was an intense political debate, if you recall. And I'm in Nimitz. I'm an engineering officer in USS Nimitz, my second sea tour, and you could just see it coming.
Mhm.
And we don't have a lot of forces in the area. We'd always had a couple of ships, and Submarines don't go in the Gulf. Aircraft carriers do not go in the Gulf.
Why is that?
It's shallow. The Gulf is peppered with little islands. It looks kind of empty until you kind of zoom in, and it
Mm,
just wasn't traditionally someplace that was operated.
mm,
We would have a destroyer frigate force with a the LaSalle was with a command ship, and a decision was made that we would help defend Saudi Arabia and others, and then the decision was made that we would reclaim Kuwait. If you remember, that went to the UN and was approved, and then this massive logistic buildup, which was we had prepared for things like that, but it was all focused on Europe.
mhm,
The Reforger, the return of forces to Europe. We're going to convoy American armor and infantry and aviation assets and help out the ones that are already pre-positioned there into, you know, the German plane where we were going to, duke it out with the Soviets. And now it was a flow into the Persian Gulf. And there was this massive long-term buildup where we, you know, moved, multiple divisions. We had a large coalition from the French and the Saudis and the British, and many nations participated one way or the other. It turns out we actually tried to get a division in through Turkey, but the negotiations sort of failed. But and we're preparing to go, so we were at the tail end of that. But massive differences. One, it was a national effort. The Navy has a series of reserve units, strangely enough, scattered across the interior of the country. So our reserve units were in Kansas, and they called them up. And so we actually activated our reserves, and they got letters that said, stand by, and then the letter that says, you will report at this date. And that augmentation, it had not happened, I believe, since World War II. Not even in the Korean War did we have reserve call up to active duty units for and it was interesting because some of them were exactly sort of kind of the perception we had was we see it coming, get ready, and others, no names. So we had a doctor who had a very established practice, and I know that he made high six figures because he constantly told everyone that and was complaining about that to everybody until I think and he was a captain, so a very senior reservist, a doctor, but it finally got so bad that I believe the XO had a conversation with him about time for you to shut up. Did you
yeah.
cash the checks? Yes. Then you got called up for a reason. But
Mhm.
my division of about 160 sailors had about 20 sailors augmented, and besides sort of the how do I get here, what do I do, they were wonderful. They saw it coming, and almost to a person was, we're ready because we watched the news, we watched CNN or whatever,
These are
and
naval
we
reservists.
packed our bags.
These are naval reservists based out of Kansas. Is that right?
Yep, several reserve units were scattered across Kansas
Why would we have naval reservists in Kansas of all places?
because that's where the people are.
Okay. Okay. So the fact that there's no water around them is moot. Doesn't really matter.
Nimitz grew up in the Midwest, where the closest body of water was a lake that was dry in the summer. So now the difference was, so we arrived at the tail end of all this. We were the relief for the Ranger, and so during the tanker war, we had a carrier out in the Gulf of Oman that provided air support, and occasionally a carrier in the Mediterranean. And total difference. We have 6 carriers in the Gulf or the Red Sea or the Mediterranean, and we're literally dashing back and forth in these little tiny patrol boxes where I remembered them because I had spent, a chunk of my life there already, and it was crazy. there were submarines with us that supposedly couldn't operate there, and when you need to, you need to. And it was totally different.
Mhm.
The tanker war we were worried about because the Iranians got caught mining, which was sort of and it wasn't the moored mines where they're in a certain location chained to the bottom, where you mark your minefield and you can lay a defensive minefield, you know where they are, so you drive around them. They were just free floating mines. You drop them and they go where wind and tide take them, which means it potentially threatens your own shipping.
For sure.
And we caught them doing that. And so part of what we were doing was literally looking for floating mines, and we learned something very important.
Why weren't they allowed to do these floating mines? Are they a part of the Geneva Convention and they're not allowed to do this because this is the way what they've agreed to in war? I always thought like some countries, and correct me if I'm wrong, Per, like forget the rules. We're just gonna do what's best for us and
Well,
that's
it was tactically disadvantageous because like I mentioned, the moored mine, you know where it is. You can
Mhm.
lay a defensive minefield to defend someplace, or you could lay an offensive minefield to prevent use of water by someone else.
I mean, we had that in the Puget Sound. We had basically moored mines in the Puget Sound,
Right.
so if folks are trying to get through, they can't.
Yeah, the Farragut, damn the torpedoes. He wasn't talking about torpedoes as we think of them. That was the name for moored mines at the time.
I got it. Okay. No clue.
But when you drop them in the water that are free floating, you've lost control of them. So if your
Mhm.
own vessel shows up, and that mine will attack anybody.
Mhm.
So
Mm.
it's almost a desperation move.
Yeah.
And what we learned was, and we literally had people up in the bow of the ship. We had to put a chair up there and a little sunscreen because it's pretty hot there, and
You don't say.
binoculars. And they were looking for mines
Did
because
they
that's how
spot
we
them?
found them.
Did they spot them from time to time?
Absolutely.
Mm.
And we would back away from them, and then you would either shoot them
Did
or
you ever get to shoot the mines, Per?
not me personally, but I saw plenty of them shot, or
Well,
we would send EOD out to get them.
I mean, everybody's got their job, right, on the vessel, and so some guys get to shoot them. I mean, I'm from Eastern Oregon, and if there was a chance for me, even though it wasn't my job, to shoot a mine that's floating in the water, I would beg to do that. Would they, is there any freedom in the military to kind of like, yeah, give it a shot? Or is it like, nope, we are
Well,
following a process?
the problem is when you shoot them, they blow up and they scatter shrapnel. And
Yeah.
so you generally didn't wanna do that. So the the EOD, explosive ordnance demolition experts would mount a small charge and blow them up that way.
Got it.
But one of the things we learned was the three-horned mines, because these mines were kind of the classic black spherical, and they had horns on top that were the detonators. And the three-horned mines were mines.
Mm.
The four-horned mines were sheep,
What?
because there's a large trade in sheep in the Gulf, strangely enough, and they carry them in cages on small freighters, and from time to time, they die, and they just toss them over the side, and they bloat and rot, and they turn black, and they float feet up. So you would get a report of a mine, and it would be, is it three-horned or four-horned? And the three-horned ones were dangerous. The four-horned ones we took a close look at, and they were sheep.
Unbelievable. Would you guys try to dispose of those sheep so no one else confused them for mines, or would you just kind of let them float by and rot away?
We usually let them by, but we would mark the location so knew where they were. Now there's another kind of interesting aside here. We're escorting these super tankers,
Mhm.
and I got to give you a scale. Destroyer is 563 feet long. I know that because I
Why
measured
why
it.
why is it 560? That seems arbitrary. Why such a strange number?
That's just how long it is.
That they
Although
That's what the engineers deemed the length should be.
a length to beam ratio for speed, there's a lot of reasons for the
Okay.
volume you need. I actually had to measure it with a hot dog once during our crossing the line ceremony by rolling the hot dog end over end, and then I had to eat the hot dog. But but
You were forced
so
to eat it after it had rolled 563 feet?
it's a crossing the line ceremony. It was a little weird.
Was it a hot day when you had to do that?
Oh, heck yeah.
So that was a nice cooked dog at the end, huh?
Yeah, the crossing the line ceremony was on the equator. Now the good news is that was okay with me because the other thing they were using was liver, and I hate liver, so that
Well,
kinda worked out for me.
who really likes liver? Let's be honest.
Some people do. Anyway, 563 feet long, about 8,000 tons. We're escorting a vessel that's 1,100 feet long,
Ooh,
400,000 tons. It
nuts.
dwarfs us, and if you actually look at photos, the actual photos, you would think it would be we're leading the convoy, right?
Right.
No, because a mine does serious damage to a the Princeton hit a mine, was seriously damaged, for example. It does serious damage to a frigate or destroyer or even cruiser. The motor vessel Bridgeton hit a mine, and they had a flooding alarm in one of their tanks. And so the escort was more of a try to find the mines by looking ahead with helicopters and then defending from inside the convoy
Mhm,
against missile and small boat attack.
mm,
And the small boat attack was tough because there's a continuous line of fast small boats running across the Gulf, and they're not trying to attack you. They're running rugs south and blue jeans north was the joke, but pretty much was true because you could see him was smuggling into Iran. And so we had to ascertain whether these are the bad guys trying to shoot us or just the smugglers who didn't care about us at all. They were just cutting through the convoy trying to make some money.
So these are like Iranians trying to get the 501s into Iran.
Iranians and Omanians. Oman is on the it
Was it
has a little piece of territory at the north end of the of Africa that
was there also like drug runners pair at the same time doing that kind of stuff?
there's a bit of opiate drug running as well, but so the difference is that sort of environment with, 3 or 4 ships to 6 carrier strike groups with all their escorts. So we had 40, 50, 60 ships just all over the place in the Gulf
Mm,
and all kinds of air cover and a massive military buildup and then a naval feint. We had 2 battleships there and Marine Corps amphibious group where we feinted a amphibious landing, which was what Iraq was very worried about, and then did the end around, as you know, to the west and
mm,
in the desert where no one can go, and basically cut off the forces in Kuwait and ground them up.
mm, mm.
And that's how the battle tested, much vaunted Republican Guard was defeated in a short campaign.
Were you surprised it was as short as it was, given that the Iranian-Iraqi conflict was lasted, for the better part of an entire decade? Were you surprised that that ended so swiftly?
Different different military force. The Iranians were less was more of a traditional infantry force with some armor. They were both armed by the Soviets. The Iraqis was a heavily mechanized force, but then got ground down in a long war. And we put into the field sort of the new post Vietnam the forces that we had put together to fight the Soviets in the German plain, Fulda Gap and all, and with a several different innovations. And there was quite the concern about because did the Iraqis have frontline Russian equipment? Not exclusively, but they had a lot of it.
Mhm.
But the armor ratio was, not counting 2 friendly fire incidents, was like 800 tanks to 0.
Mm.
And tactics and training and equipment paid off.
So do you feel like, I mean, I got to admit, like, I was really surprised, like probably the rest of the world was, when I woke up on a Saturday morning. I was like, holy smokes, we're bombing Iran. And then I was equally surprised with, their rhetoric and the things that they would say was just so shocking. My entire life of, these really flowery depictions of how they were gonna what they were gonna do to the US and do to me and do to our leaders. And then they just got bombed, and it just kind of, it seemed really simple from our side. Do you think that there's just an incredible imbalance in the Middle East in regards to, like, technologies and capabilities between that and the West? Or, like, how come an Iraqi and Iranian army just goes at it with no resolution for a decade, and then a Western power goes in there and just annihilates it? Like, is it just incredibly lopsided, or what's going on?
Well, it's planning, it's preparation, it's training, it's it's the nature of the militaries. If you have a military where, you know, the government's head's brother-in-law runs the joint, and versus a professional military that's very meritocratic,
Mhm.
but also has to, you know, parabellum is, if you want peace, prepare for war, is prepared, and prepared not in a sort of, you know marching band sort of way. And nothing wrong with marching bands, but not in a sort of a visual way, but in a actually doing what you needed to do. I mean, one of the
Mhm.
reasons we could convoy ships was we did that all the time, and one of the reasons that deploying to the Gulf, it's hard, but was able to be done because we routinely do that.
Mhm.
It was interesting that the contrast. The in the tanker war, the French had a ship there, we had 3 ships there, the British had a ship there, and the Russians, the Soviets, had a ship there.
Mhm.
But the difference was we went in, 2 weeks, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 days, patrolled almost all the time. The the Soviets had a frigate or a destroyer. They would come in, anchor, and literally drop their anchor and raise their laundry. They would put their laundry up because they just weren't used to the maintenance and the fuel requirements, and their presence was, "If you need us, we'll be here," versus actually actively doing things.
Right.
I would say, just like it's being closely watched today, our Chinese friends are closely watching. One, because they buy discount oil from Iran, they were their major, customer, but they're
Yeah.
also closely watching the military situation. And to kind of try to answer your question, who would have thought that Ukraine, after several nations had been quickly attacked and overrun, even Crimea,
Mhm.
near bloodless overrunning, that that the Russians, as the sort of heirs to the Soviet military, that a quick decapitation attack on Kyiv would be stopped. Now, having said that, the time between the taking of Crimea and the launching of the attack was not idle time. Ukraine was getting ready, and I don't know, but I suspect they were getting a lot of help from others getting ready, and the Russians have now spent more time in the Ukrainian war than they spent in World War II.
No.
So it's a difference in it's certainly in the ability to project power, because no other country could project that kind of military power on the other side of the planet.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's not even in our backyard. If I would, think about the countries that hostilities could originate from, Iran is definitely one of the three. So I always think of, like, Iran, Russia, China, right? That's things pretty commonplace that Americans think of those as the three countries where we could potentially be in conflict with. And I'd probably rank them that way, meaning, like, Iran, yeah, I mean, it's true. It was easiest one to fight a war against. Russia would be second, and China, goodness, I mean, no clue. No clue how difficult that might be.
Although I would also say, think about the conventional wisdom. the conventional wisdom would be we would be unable to, once Kuwait was taken, a ground war to take it back would be a slog.
That's true.
Maybe we were more capable, but the Republican Guard is battle hardened. They have relatively frontline equipment and vastly outnumber our armored force.
Mm.
And it was done. And then later, any attack on Iran by either Israel or the US or the two in concert would have devastating consequences because the Middle East would explode.
Mhm.
Other countries would join in. It would be devastating. The proxies would all simultaneously attack Israel. And think about what's happened. And, I'm not taking a political stance here. I'm just saying, look at what's happened versus if we thought, let's say 4 years ago or 6 years ago or 10 years ago, that Iran was at the edge of nuclear capability, the discussion would have been something like, well, if we take military action, it would be this horrific strategic situation would be in, and we're not in it.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, we're focused on the Strait of Hormuz, but once again, if you've read closely, a Greek tycoon said, "I'm sending my tankers through."
Wow.
And we haven't elected to convoy at the moment, but do we need to? Because
Mm.
we have lots of capabilities, and I strongly suspect that just like it was in the tanker war, mine layers' lifetime laying mines, and they were laying them at night so they wouldn't be discovered, but we had quite the capability to see what was going on at night. Their lifetime is not long.
Mhm. Mhm.
But you still have to deal with the mines, and as far as the open source things I've read was that Iran laid 12 mines, and that convinced Lloyd's of London to shut down the insurance. So that was very strategic, 12 mines, but
Were you surprised, Per, that Iran is attacking neighboring countries? I was, because I always kind of group the Middle East together. And of course, they're at conflict at times, just like you shared with the Iraqi-Iranian war. But are you surprised that the Iranians decided to bomb neighboring nations, not even U.S. installations within those countries, but areas that are not that?
I'm not surprised because some of the actions they've taken don't seem sort of as calculated. Certainly an understanding of the long-standing Sunni-Shia relationship and the fact that, you know, Saudi Arabia felt this intense threat from Iraq, but they also felt a threat from Iran. And if we take them at their word from the negotiations that they were on the verge of having or have enough material for 11 special weapons, nuclear weapons, not all of those are reserved for Israel or the United States. Is the neighbors would feel a deep, deep threat from that, which is interesting because if you think carefully for a second, just next door, both Pakistan and India are nuclear-armed countries,
That's right.
looking at each other across a long border with which has had a lot of conflict,
Mhm.
but they don't perceive a threat from them particularly.
Mm. Mm.
But, it remains to be seen because we're still in the middle of it, but there's a lot of history here.
Yeah, there sure is. It's pretty deep. So thinking about how history just keeps unfolding, and we're still, like we just talked about, we're still in the Middle East. You, Per, congratulations. You're not part of Gulf War One. You're going to be a part of Gulf War Two, from the Pacific, really, from the Pacific perspective. And you were on the USS Carl Vinson, and this, of course, is post 9/11. How did you receive the short notice to deploy your deployment orders for the Carl Vinson? Tell us a little bit about what this, 10 years from the Kuwaiti liberation to the Vincent. What did this look like? How did you get on that?
Well, it requires a little bit of an understanding of sort of the administrative process. The Joint Staff allocates plans, but the actual combatant commands, the United States-based commands produce ready forces, and they deliver them to the combatant commands who then use them. And there's sort of a set schedule. A carrier battle group works up. It's a cycle. These are all large machines, so carriers go through a maintenance period, change the oil, and a lot of other stuff, upgrades. And then there's often a large change in crew. And then the air wing, which is a separate command, also trains. And then you get them together, and they go through usually 6 months of workup training, and then they deploy on a schedule because you only have so many of them, so you sort of rotate around. That's not what happened. Once again, 9/11 happens, and I was actually in Pearl Harbor, ironically, and
Unbelievable.
the first airplane hit at 8:36, and
what were
so
you doing there? Why were you there?
I was a system program manager in a ballistic missile defense program office, and we were having a ballistic missile defense in the Pacific meeting, and I was going there to give a presentation, and it's 2:30 in the morning, and I'm sitting in the BOQ sleeping, and I wake up because I hear the gates being closed. I was pretty close to one of the main gates, and I went, "That's odd." And then I look out and I see a bunch of activity, and I go, "Something is happening." And I flip the TV on to see the second airplane hit the World Trade Center.
Eric, what were you doing up so early? This is like in the middle of the night for you, isn't it?
It woke me up because I heard activity outside.
Mm.
And as soon as I looked out the window, and Pearl Harbor is interesting because it's sort of circular, and I was staying at at the temporary lodging, and I was just going to walk across the street up to the headquarters to this presentation, and then I saw one of the ships there had a missile up on its rail, and I went, "That is not good. That is not something normal." And I saw the base locking down, so I knew immediately something was happening.
Mhm, mhm.
But a good friend of mine was the officer in charge of one of our local detachments there, so I just called him up and said, "Do you need anything? Because this conference is not happening." And he said, "No, I'm okay for now, but let me know your phone number if we need you to come in." But I guess we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it happens. So we had just got out of the shipyard, so we're starting this 6-month workup. And so we were going to go down to San Diego, pick up our air wing, because a lot of our air wing was down in San Diego, and then go for a 1-month training cruise and then come back to Bremerton. But easy to tell, people watch the news, and you'll love this. One of the indicators is for a deployment, people bring stuff, and just by measuring the draft of the ship, we knew the ship was loading up. So yeah, we're going for a 30-day cruise to work up, and then we're coming back. People had a full expectation, we weren't. And then the way the actual notification happens is the Joint Staff says we need a carrier, and won't say which one, and we'll tell, or we need something, and we'll tell the Army or the Navy, provide one, please. Now, there's only so many, so it's not hard to pick. And that flows down through the system, and I was responsible for communications and weapons in the carrier. So, we were on the lookout for that message, but it has to pass through about 4 different hands, so it actually gets to us.
Mhm.
Well, because of the job I had in ballistic missile defense, I had some Joint Staff access. So I just went and looked, and I was able to see the first in that chain of messages coming.
Mhm.
And so I make 2 copies of it. It's a classified message. And I run and see my captain and say, "This is happening at the Joint Staff." And he went, "Okay,
Mm.
who knows about this?" "You and I do." And he said, "Well, and here's 1 copy for you, and I have a second copy for the XO." And he said, "I'm going to see the admiral, go see the XO, and the XO, the second command, was actually doing a a a spot check, a watching maintenance down in the nuclear plant. And strangely enough, even though I was a kind of weapons person, I had been an engineer in the carrier, so I went and found him, and sort of said, "XO, I need to interrupt you." He says, what do you want?" And I said, "You need to read this. I just gave this to the captain." He went, "Okay," folds it up, puts it in his pocket.
Mm.
And then we just waited for the official word. But what we were doing was off the coast of Hawaii, and the world is broken up into areas, and you're allowed to be in certain areas because you're in that responsibility. So the polite way to say it is we aggressively patrolled at the very edge of our area because there's some mandatory places you need to be.
What area is Hawaii in? I mean, the only reason I say that is because, I've been to Hawaii a couple times, and it is in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing around it.
And one of those lines of demarcation between Third Fleet and Seventh Fleet is just around there. And so we were aggressively patrolling right at the edge. So when we got the message, we crossed the line in just a few minutes, and
Mhm.
we're heading at high speed to where we needed to go, which was not the Gulf. That was not our order,
Why did they not send you to the Gulf? What's going on?
because we have 6 carriers there out of our 11.
Mhm,
We've got 2 in deep maintenance,
mhm.
and the concern was, to be blunt, we're sending a large chunk of our Army, our Air Force, and our Navy, and our Marine Corps to deal with Iraq. And at the time, North Korea wasn't very friendly.
Mhm.
And the concern was the ability to deter North Korea from taking advantage, because we would not have the forces to deal with them in the same way we normally would have if something had gotten rough there.
It's kind of
So
interesting that you say that, Per, because, looking at history, World War II, the Germans largely got defeated because they were being exhausted on both sides of the front, right? And so the Russians were on the east and we were on the west with the French and the Brits, and they got they got they got just it turned into a real shallow response from them, and they got overwhelmed. And so we are basically thinking along the same lines of like, yeah, all the heat's happening in the Middle East, but if we basically push everything out there, then we're vulnerable out here in the Pacific, huh?
and 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 North Korea knew that the normal response they would get to certain provocative things, the forces were just not available because they're busy elsewhere. Think about the strategic risk that Nazi Germany, pretty terrible place.
Mhm.
In 1939, their forces were moving further and further east into Poland. The
Yeah.
bulk of their armor, the bulk of their best forces, the bulk of their Luftwaffe, and the forces facing the French and British were pretty small. They
Mhm.
took a huge risk that if, during the phony war, if Britain and France said, "We're just gonna drive to Berlin," well, their forces are moving the other way and moving further,
Mhm.
and turning them around is not trivial.
Do you think
So
that happened, Per, to some degree? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember in history the French fell fast. And so the Western Front really, like in World War II, it collapsed and France was occupied pretty swiftly by the Germans. And not the same case on the east side.
well, and again, the bulk of the German Wehrmacht was advancing into Poland and Eastern Europe, advancing away from the Western Front. And France had mobilized, and Great Britain had put forces, the British Expeditionary Force, into France, and they were facing a very reduced German front in front of them. And there was a quick French offensive, and then they stopped. And that was the big worry, was they would drive deep into industrialized Germany, and by the time they turned around their forces, I mean, World War II might have been over in a few months,
Hmm. Hmm.
but it wasn't to be.
Hmm.
So what was our task while everyone else was in the Gulf was to be highly visible to North Korea and just ring their bell from time to time and remind them, hey, we're here. And it wasn't just the Carl Vinson. It was some forces from the Air Force and the Army, but they were much reduced from what they otherwise would have been. And it was uh, responding that we know that there's a risk here and we're watching you. I'm gonna be very careful how I say this. One of the funnest things that happened was in a communication from North Korea that we're not supposed to see necessarily. There was a discussion about how they felt good that the Carl Vinson, the mightiest of its class, we were the same as all the other Nimitz, it was sent to watch them, and we saw that and got a good chuckle.
So that kind of like tickled their fancy a little bit that they kind of felt like that they were valued enough as a threat that we would send something that significant over to them. So when you said like ring their bell, is this basically you just wanted to kind of like shoot off a few missiles, do some joint operations with the South Koreans to show a show of force to say like, hey guys, no funny business over here.
Well, not necessarily shoot off missiles, but carriers can do many things. One of the things they can do is they're mobile, so they show up places you don't expect them to be, and that surprise is part of their power. Is like they're suddenly somewhere with with a dominant air power.
What do you mean they're mobile? How many knots can these things go at?
So in excess, the standard line is in excess of 30 knots, but a little math, 30 is nuclear powered, so fuel isn't an issue. 30 knots times 24 hours, that's 600 miles.
Mm.
So, I mean, they're the biggest mobile machine, possible. Eh, Super tankers are bigger, but nowhere near as complex. But
Mhm.
we did the exact opposite. Hey, we're here and we're still here. We didn't do a lot. We didn't want to provoke, but it was we're here and we know that you know that we know that you know that we're watching you. And and again, that's one of the things that naval power can do, which is it appears to be nothing because it's deterrence, but it changes strategic thinking. Hey, there might be a opportunity here for some skullduggery on the Korean Peninsula, and no, there wasn't. Now, when we went, the deployment order usually specifies a day you start and a day you end. It's normally 6 months. We had an indefinite, "When's your return?" "Don't know," because we're fresh out of carriers, because we have 6, and we're gonna need to relieve a couple of them because a couple are already there. We have a couple in deep maintenance. So, you're the last pitcher on the bench. There's no one behind you. So we were told to be ready for a indefinite, maybe a year deployment, maybe the longest deployment since World War II.
Can you guys stay in the same place for a year, or do you have to, like, port into places to get refueled and food po and all that? Like, can you
Well,
guys stay there?
underway replenishment means you can replenish at sea,
Mm, mm.
and and major morale kind of issue, but once again, we saw it coming, and this is where leadership's job is to help tell people. One of the things that I did was, I reserved the command center in the carrier, the staff's we had the strike commander on board, and all my leadership in my department, I brought him in and said, "This is a classified briefing. Here's what we're doing. Here's why it's important." And even though it seems like what's happening over there is kind of where all the action is, and if we're highly successful, this will be a long, long, boring deployment
That's
where
right.
absolutely nothing happens.
Yeah.
That is our goal. And you need to motivate and prepare yourself. So, we had been doing 6-month deployments. If this is a 9 or a 12-month deployment, let's talk about what has to be different and what we can do and what we'll need because tag, we're it.
So
And
how long did it last, Per?
It ended up being 9 months and change.
Did any of the guys that were on that boat, did they think like, man, I want to get into the action. I want to be in the Middle East, or were folks pretty confident and pretty comfortable staying out in the Pacific?
Well, there's certainly that sort of, the same feeling that the Marines on the expeditionary group that's heading there is, the discussion is maybe they'll take Carg Island, maybe they won't. But just that they could is power. But they wanna, because they've trained for it their entire lives in a way, in the same way that people there certainly they did. But the mission was the mission, and the mission was important. And like I said, convincing people that have you played football?
I played, I mean, never played in high school, but I played quite a bit just
So
for fun.
so so think about, the defensive end. Your job is not to tackle the running back. Your job is to prevent him to get to the outside.
That's right.
And so you're not gonna get a tackle out of it. You're not gonna get a statistic. But if you fail and the person gets to the outside and scores, you failed. So your job is to force the play back to the inside. And a good coach, when you do that, will say, "Hey, Bob got the tackle, but you did your job and prevented a touchdown. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Please do that again."
So the the those in the Middle East knew that you guys were sitting out in the Pacific, but at the same time, you said we had a pretty big fleet in the Middle East to engage, and so it was, like you said, it was just basically holding a potential adversary like North Korea in check and a real show of force that entire time.
Yeah, and that's precisely what the mission was. So, one of the discussions about, what are the extensive naval power, anywhere from escorting ships that aren't even yours, at least technically, I guess they are now if they're reflagged, to where what do you want? I want a boring transit, and then we're gonna do another one, and then we're gonna do another one.
Mhm,
To it's that range of responses
mhm,
where command ship where, anywhere from the big one on the Korean Peninsula and having an active role in that to having a cocktail party in Indonesia and meeting with people, and how that's another show of diplomatic power that naval power could do.
So they said to you, prepare for 9 months, maybe a year of boredom. What did you guys do on the boat to stay entertained? Or were you guys still, like, doing those massive shifts like you were before in the late '80s? Or did you guys have more time to twiddle your thumbs and enjoy each other's company a bit and whatnot? What did that look like?
Carriers are a little different because there's a lot of people. I mean,
Yeah.
small ships, as an engineer, as an object gets bigger, its volume grows as a cube, so you have
Mm,
more room, and the carrier is sized for the flight deck, so you have a lot more people. So you generally don't have that kind of port and starboard kind of watch, but the responsibilities are tremendous. What I saw, and it wasn't amusing at the time, but I'm amused now by it, was people were literally having pools. First off, the topic of we're going on an indefinite deployment, the topic of will we have the longest deployment ever? There was an active pool of, well, first, what was it? And it wasn't top down, it was bottom up. Several different groups of people had their own lists of these are the longest deployments ever. And, the little sign with here's where you are now. And if you think about it, this is sort of the Army has an expression called embrace the suck. When something's really bad, you don't complain about it, you don't bemoan it, you embrace it.
right.
And so people literally embrace this idea that we're going to be gone for a year and we're not going to change it. It is what it is. So you just dealt with it. And there was all kinds of kind of crazy stuff. There were pools. There was kind of the hey, my dog's bigger than your dog because our deployment's going to be longer. There was I mean, every deployment you kinda have this, how many eggs were cooked and how many people were and there was the numbers got huge in terms of, you're on a ship with 5,000 of your closest friends, and morale was surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, high, because even though the mission was sort of not necessarily what you had been trained for, it was necessarily what you've been trained for, which is a deterrence mission. You don't necessarily deploy to go to war. You're deploying to try not to go to war. But by doing it, by causing the risk of someone else's actions just to be too high for them.
Mm, mm, mm. Unbelievable. So, Per, you also have some experience living and life on the naval nuclear shipyards. Does that include here in our backyard in Bremerton? Do you ever
I
use?
had, I had, I had, I had 3 separate tours at Bremerton and one at Portsmouth. I have to say it like that because people there think I speak funny because I speak west of the Rockies English. So,
Where's Portsmouth? Where's that?
so, so Portsmouth is in New Hampshire,
Okay.
but but Portsmouth Naval Shipyard it's on an island in the river in right opposite Kittery, Maine. In fact, you can't get there from New Hampshire. The 2 bridges extend into Maine, and because one state had a income tax and the other state didn't, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard is in New Hampshire, but it's legally it's this weird situation.
Well, yeah,
So
Portsmouth itself, isn't that just on the border with Maine? Isn't that right?
right, it's definitely in New Hampshire,
Mhm.
and our address was New Hampshire, but strangely enough, I bought a used car when I was there, and I went to the New Hampshire because I had a New Hampshire address. I went to New Hampshire to register it, and they said, "Can't register your car here because you're not technically in New Hampshire, but my address is, but you're not technically not in New Hampshire." And so I went to Maine to one of their offices, and they said, "But you're not in Maine." And I went, and they suggested go up to the main office up in the Capitol, and I went, and that's a couple hours away. And so I was just smart enough to go, somebody's done this before. So I talked to our command master chief, and literally the answer was, you go out to this little DMV that's out in up the road in Maine, and go to the front desk and ask for this lady, and
No.
she knows how to do it. And so I go there and I go, "Is, this lady here?" "Oh, yeah, she's in the back." She comes out and goes, "Hey, I live on the shipyard, but she does not know exactly what to," and there's some special, you know, special sauce that got applied, and here's your main plate, even though you have a New Hampshire address.
Perry, you need to have that, up on the bulletin board and maybe one of those things where people can, pull a little number to get a hold of this lady. You guys need some type of some type of system in order to make sure that the next folks don't have to deal with it like you did. That's crazy that, such a massive institution like that has to call Sally up. She'll short you out.
Well, it's the largest employer in the area,
Right.
as a shipyard. But the employees are either residents of Maine or residents of New Hampshire. So the 2 states fought over who would tax them because it's an island in the middle of the river, and it actually was legally decided that it's New Hampshire, but not really. So it's just a really odd situation.
So these naval shipyards, if you don't know, they are it's kind of weird because Bremerton's about 30 minutes from where we're at right now.
Mhm.
And you can see the shipyard, and they're right there in a populated area, and you can't get into it unless you have special clearance. And if you do have clearance, you can't bring, I know, mobile cameras. They even make the iPhone. They'll rip the camera out of the back of the iPhone when people are at the, at the shipyards. But then you got a lot of civilian crew that are painting stuff and whatnot, and they're getting special clearance. What's it like to be working on a shipyard? And what did your life look like on those shipyards? And I know these were nuclear vessels. Did you get involved with that side of things as well too, Per? What tell us a little bit about what life was like on those places.
Well, it's almost exclusively a civilian workforce, highly trained, highly capable, doing non-nuclear. A big part of a nuclear vessel is not nuclear,
Right.
but doing all kinds of work, including nuclear work, which has you know unbelievably high standards.
Hmm.
There's a reason, and the standard sort of line is the Navy esteemed 70. I think every year they have a new number. I think the last one I saw was 77 million miles, and we've operated over 500 nuclear reactors. Not one single nuclear accident or radiological incident that's harmed a person or marine wildlife. And the only reason you get that is unbelievably high standards. I mean, it's just and an absolute, and this was all the legacy of Admiral Rickover, which was high standards, the highest possible training. I mean, you can imagine, nuclear trained officers were individually selected. You had to go to Washington D.C. and go to this somewhat odd interview and be interviewed, and where they would kind of take the mark of the person. I was an engineering duty officer. I served on several nuclear ships, and as in sort of non-nuclear engineering side, and then as an engineering duty officer, qualified in nuclear maintenance. And the standard and requirements, it's a zero defect. You cannot make a mistake, and we will all stop. And the culture, the ability of the most junior person to go, this doesn't look right to me. We should stop. And then you stop and you go, thank you for telling us that. You look very careful at it and go, no, I think it's okay. And not, and don't confuse this with micromanagement, but senior leadership being intimately involved, not micromanaging. The decisions are still where they need to be, but being aware of what's happening. What strikes me is our local Safeway, the manager is very, very involved. And I had mentioned when I saw him, hey, you just got this new product. And he was like, I don't know that. I mean, not that he decides what products they have, but the
Hmm.
fact he didn't know that kind of bothered him because he's that attuned to what's happening in his store.
Right.
And like you mentioned, one thing people don't think about is not only proximity to Bremerton. The city of Bremerton is right on the fence line.
Yeah, that's right.
People live their lives a few hundred meters from nuclear maintenance, the deepest possible nuclear maintenance, and they feel like they can live their lives there, and not that far from Tacoma, and not that far from Seattle. And there's this sort of intense, deep understanding of what that means. Let me tell you a sea story. When I was working on a carrier, is outside of our shipyard fence line, because the shipyard used to be all the shipyard, and then it had a sort of naval station side, and then we reorganized, and now there's a naval station that sort of manages the commissary and the PX and the non shipyard stuff, right? The shipyard's the waterfront, but outside the shipyard, a dead whale washed up under a pier. It happens in Puget Sound.
It sure does.
They die from disease, or they're struck by ship, or something happens. And I'm the deputy superintendent on the large availability on John C. Stennis, and I get this news, and the naval station is sort of handling it, and I immediately rush in to see the captain of the John C. Stennis, because it's the next pier over.
Mm.
And I said, we need to escalate this and get the right people looking at this,
Mm.
because the automatic implication, dead whale at the shipyard, and there's nuclear maintenance happening right next to it. There's a public relations issue that's tremendous here. Now, we hadn't done anything, but but that sensitivity is there, and so the captain of the ship calls up the naval station, and I'm at the same time calling the shipyard commander, saying, "Hey, this just happened," and the naval station is kind of getting its press release ready, and they're like not tied into this, and I I don't wanna get into the details, but I was party to a very one-way conversation
Bible.
where the naval station somebody did not understand, and it was like this, and that eventually led to the shipyard commander calling the local admiral saying, "Hey, we've got to carefully manage this."
Mm.
And and notice I didn't use a word like cover up or something. No, there's a dead whale there, and
Yeah,
that's news.
that's
But
right.
but the context matters.
Mhm.
It's going to have a autopsy.
Mhm.
The Coast Guard's gonna manage it, and we're gonna find out what happened.
Yeah.
Was this related to the nuclear maintenance? We don't know. We don't assess it is.
No.
We're not sure how that would be, but we're going to assess it. It's got our attention.
Yeah. That's right.
I mean, this is not a minor thing.
So, Per, I don't know if you can even talk about this, but I think for folks that aren't from the Puget Sound, like Bremerton and that whole area, it's a little sleepy. Meaning, like, it's not the center of the action. Like, the center of the action for the city, of course, is right in Seattle and
Mhm.
probably the east side in the Redmond, Bellevue area. That's where, like, a lot of the action's happening. Per and I are in Tacoma. It's the third largest city in the state, and there's a lot of action here. It's more blue collar, but a lot of stuff going on, a lot of manufacturing. Big port, massive port. But Bremerton, that whole area is a little quieter, but I've been told that we have a massive amount of nuclear weapons, like around the key port area and nuclear submarines and whatnot. And so even though we might not know about what's going on with the Navy, living in the Puget Sound, there's a lot of stuff happening.
Well, the geography is a little unusual because traditionally, the Navy was in the center of your port, Boston, New York, the shipyards in England. In this case, it was the wild West Coast
Yeah.
where Mare Island was established as the first shipyard because it was literally an island of horses. It was empty.
Mm.
And Puget Sound Naval Shipyard was established. Well, at the time, Seattle and Tacoma were the sort of, and Olympia were the major ports. But this was wooden ships and iron men, and the force had already been cut down mostly in Seattle. So, and the land was expensive. So they picked Bremerton because it was well forested. It had a pretty protected harbor, and it was, like you said, sort of a small area. And then they had to recruit and establish a workforce there. But yes, you have this the largest technical facility in the Navy, 11,000. It's multinational. Puget Sound Naval Shipyard has detachments all over the place: San
Mhm.
Diego, Japan, Guam, Everett, up at Bangor. But the knowledge base of it in Seattle and Tacoma is pretty small because
Yeah.
it's sort of out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, that's right. It sure is. So, as we start wrapping things up here a bit, Pear, I mean, it's really incredible. I mean, like I said earlier, like hindsight's 2020, and it's amazing how you were basically kind of just like taking orders from your superiors. You're in the Navy, they're sending you to areas that you've got to be in, but you were like in the midst of so many historical moments over the last, what is that? Can you believe that? Last 35 years or so. It's amazing. Amazing the times that you were able to spend in our military. What would you say if you could just say maybe even just one example of a moment that changed the way you think about being a person of service or being a person of sacrifice? How did that shift from you? Because, we're as Americans, we're very independent. We're very we can be very self-focused, but our military can be really a place of service and service over self. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I thought about this when we talked earlier about the question. And what kind of came to mind was kind of a little sea story. When I was in the command ship, I've got sort of a positive story and a not positive story. And they both kind of highlight that service kind of thing. Is is the Blue Ridge is a command ship. And basically in World War II, amphibious assaults, the most complex naval operation, had a command ship which both had Navy and Army and Marine Corps commanders. And the amphibious assault would happen, and then that command would shift ashore, but very complex operation. And the Blue Ridge was purpose built to be that. In fact, it was the ship that was in command for the evacuation of Vietnam. It was a command ship that was deployed to the Gulf for Gulf War II, and the Nav sent the Navy commander was embarked. So it has some self defense capabilities, but it's just a massive command post basically. Well, I'm at the end of my tour, and one of the things we had talked about was sort of that diplomatic engagement. We would travel around, do exercises, but we would host parties. We were professional party hosters. And it was engagement where you engage with allies or near allies or neutral and even adversaries. We visited Vladivostok and met our Russian friends. We visited China, Qingdao, and met our Chinese friends. You're engaging with them. You're trying to form some connection. And quick little funny story about it is my office was on the main deck. I was the electronics officer, and the main deck passageway, which leads from the flight deck where visitors would arrive down into the ship, was something I was responsible for. And we fancied it up. Why? Because in any given week, the president or the prime minister or the admiral or the grand poobah, it was just amazing who came through there.
That's
And
right.
And so we had this gorgeous blue tile. We had the ship's logo cut out in tile that we handmade. But we had a radar room there, and it was the emergency buffer squad because literally, oh, the president of Indonesia is coming in 2 hours, unexpected, or it was like changed. And we literally had a crew that would rush out and would make that place a palace. And that was just kind of part of the job. Well, that doesn't seem like naval power, but it is. Another one was our forward deck was mostly clear because it was where our big HF antennas were. And we had a giant big top, literally a circus big top, because the Pacific, it rains a lot, or it's really sunny and hot. And we would hold parties. And we had and this is 7th Fleet, the 7th Fleet commander was embarked. So my boss's boss's boss is embarked in our ship. So the person responsible for all of the Western Pacific and a piece of the Indian Ocean. And we would hold these big parties, and we were part of the props. So being in dress uniform, speaking with the local potentates, and just sort of doing it. Well, we did that, and I was transferring from the ship in Indonesia, and I had a traditional hail and farewell. We said hello to our oncoming, and I was departing. And so I had to pack on my stuff and fly out through Indonesia. And one of the persons that arrived there, I found out after I had departed and had gotten back to the States, brand new ensign. So brand new officer, Daniel Johnson. And I remember the name because it's easy because we had the party at the Hard Rock Cafe in Bali, and they made this big poster of it with the Hales, a few names, Daniel Johnson, and then Per Provencher leaving, and they gave me the poster to take with me. And of course, it's just one more thing, and I rolled it up. It's like, what am I going to do with this? Well, I eventually had it. It was a really nice poster, so I had it framed. But here he is, a 22-year-old ensign, junior officer, and he's a deck officer on a command ship. And going into port, one of his sailors got caught up in a line, and he went to save him and actually saved his life. But in the process of doing so, he lost both legs at the knee. And he was medically discharged. And he went to law school, kind of ran a speaking circuit for a while, and then got into local government. He was just appointed, and I wrote it down because I just noticed. I just noticed he was just appointed the head of the North Carolina Department of Transportation. He actually ran for Congress too, and positive, upbeat. In fact, if you look at his bio, it mentioned he was a surface warfare officer assigned to Blue Ridge. Period. Doesn't mention this horrific accident, and it was just sort of upbeat about it. And he was in the Navy less than a year, active duty.
It's incredible how some folks respond to situations like that, and sometimes they just kind of like throw up the white flag. This guy dives even deeper into life. It's awesome.
Yeah, very successful lawyer. Ran for Congress, wasn't elected, but several positions, and was just appointed by the governor. It's a gubernatorial selection to be director of transportation there. So sort of that sacrifice. So that's sort of the serious part of it. The not so serious part. So I'm leaving Bali, and I've got a bag, and I had sent away, because I've got to travel by myself. I've got to get from Bali to the capital of Indonesia, and then I'm going to take a plane, and then we got to pack up our stuff and move back to the States. And I had to get to Blue Ridge by myself on the way out there, and the lovely Mrs. P with 2 toddlers had to move from the States to Japan by herself. This unbelievable act. Later we had a friend who had to move cross town, and it's not that I had to restrain the lovely Mrs. P, but I had to kind of remind her, you've been to Hackett School. Nobody wants to do that, but her friend was complaining about, you don't know how hard it is to move. I mean, I've got to move across town. It's like she moved across the Pacific to like a foreign country. Well, anyway, I'd gotten there on the ship. I don't have a visa stamp. So how do you leave the country? Turns out we have an agreement with the Indonesian government, and it's a formal letter that the 7th Fleet produces that says, please allow this not so dashing naval officer to leave the country because he came in on the ship. Because you have no, I had a diplomatic passport, but I also had a regular passport I was traveling on, and I have no visa entering the country. Good to go. So I'm nervous. I leave our hail and farewell, got my bag, head to the airport. And the Bali airport's this little tiny airport. Go to security. And the key here is the Indonesian army runs security at their airports. That's a key thing here. So I go up to the person, show them my nice letter, and the person says, I don't know what that is. Please go through that door. And I go, okay. So I go through the door, and it's a cell. And it's like, what? And there's this drunk expat British guy in there, kind of chilling, and I'm going, this is not good. But I got there way early. It's like 4 hours to my flight, and I'm going, this is not good. This is not good. Because the person just didn't recognize the letter. And I'm going, what am I going to do here? And guess who walks in? The gentleman in charge of security at the airport was an Indonesian army officer that I had just been at a party at the previous night at the Big Top.
See how that works?
We had been yucking it up. And he goes, hey, what are you doing in my jail? And I went, hey, because they didn't like my letter. And he went, oh, no. Snaps the fingers, open the cell, not the drunk guy, that guy, let him out. And then he says, go through that door. And I go, I don't want to go through any more doors.
That's a good comment.
I don't want to go through any more doors. No. It's okay.
It's a good door.
It's a good door. So I go through that door, and now I'm on the other side of security, but I don't have anything. There's no stamp or anything. So I, quiet as a church mouse, go to my gate. I sit down and I try to get as small as possible and
Mhm.
absolutely blend into the woodwork, and just want to get on that plane.
Yeah.
And then, just to add insult to injury, another officer from the 7th Fleet staff shows up. I didn't know he's on the same plane. I didn't know he was transferring at the time. And it goes, "Hey." I go, "Hey." And I went, "How'd security go for you?" And he said, "Oh, I showed him the letter. It was no big deal." And I'm going, wow. But it turned out great because the main airport in Tokyo is Narita. There's a small airport that's in downtown Tokyo, but it's really constricted. And Narita it's not even SeaTac. It's a couple hours away. And you take the train from there. So I'm anticipating having my bag, catching a train down to Yokosuka, then transferring to a subway, then taking the subway, and then walking up to where we lived in Ikego. And I went, well, I guess we're riding a train. And he went, oh, no. I've got a van arranged because it's good to be 7th Fleet staff. So van's picking me up. You need a ride? So we get to the capital. We fly to Narita. We get in the van, and I'm going, that wasn't too bad. And it drops me off right at my place I was living. It was great.
Hey, Per, that's a great story. That's really good. I mean, that's memorable. That's something that would be hard to forget. Speaking of that, if you could talk to your younger self, go all the way back into the 80s at the very start of your career, what would you say to yourself? What advice would you give to yourself that might make it a little bit better, a little bit easier, a little bit more richer perhaps? What would you say?
I would have said what I noticed in my first tour, and I got better at this as I went along. Always take the hardest jobs because someone's got to do them. And especially in a sort of meritocratic thing, don't be worried about difficult things. Now, no system is perfect. Certainly the Navy isn't perfect. And I saw some things that weren't so good. But generally speaking, is taking a hard job and doing well at it, or moving into a difficult situation and making it just average. I mean, in my mind, an inner city principal who's assigned to the worst school in the city, and then 2 years later, they're average. That person's a hero. Thank you very much. Versus someone who goes into the best school and then, 2 years later, oh, they're number 4. Well, it's like, what happened there?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And enjoy it while it lasts, because I can tell you every ship I was ever on, you know, it was time to go. But then, nostalgia does kick in. I remember vividly the person I relieved in Blue Ridge. The relief was while we were at Yokosuka, and his lovely missus was on the pier going, "Get him down here," because you know, let's go. But take advantage of things as you have them, because you don't get the chance, and ask to do things. I
Mhm.
mean, some of the things that were just random. I mean, I got to witness a Hong Kong judicial proceeding. In fact, somewhere I've got the official, really fancy letter from the embassy designating me an official representative of the United States government.
Mm.
And and the reason I did that was I was the off-going command duty officer, and the off-going, since you're still kind of around, sometimes
Mhm.
get tasked with things. And I was literally eating breakfast after having kind of turned over, and EXO came in and go, "Oh, you're the off-going? Got a job for you."
Mm.
"Oh, what's that?" "Go get an dress uniform. No, go get the civilian clothes and goes. You need to catch a cab to the embassy. They're going to give you a letter, and we have a sailor that's been arrested, and you have to be the court observer."
Oh boy.
And this is Hong Kong, and this is when I was in Blue Ridge, and it still had this odd British legal structure, but Chinese.
Sure.
So imagine a Chinese lady.
What year was this again, Per?
Oh, that would have been 98, maybe?
Didn't it transfer over just around that time?
It just was just before the transfer. So they had British barristers mostly, but it was a Chinese judge in a robe and a wig, and they had the cage where the accused was. It literally was a cage. And I'm sitting in there, and our case hadn't come up yet. And the case before was a drug smuggler, life sentence. And I'm going, oh, this is not good. And
Mm, mm,
and so our sailor comes up there and had too much to drink and got in a fight, caused some damage.
mm, mhm.
And so he gets called, and literally they kind of bring him up. It's this weird arrangement. They have like stairs. They climb the stairs, and you arrive and you're in a cage with the accused. It's very sort of Rumpole of the Bailey kind of stuff.
Mm.
And the judge goes, "Is there a representative here?" And I said, "Yes, Your Honor." And of course, they know I'm not British and not Chinese. It's just some blue-eyed American guy.
Yeah.
And it's like, "Will you pay for the damages?" And I said, "Absolutely, Your Honor." And she goes, "Great, dismissed."
Did you get
Yes, ma'am.
authorization to pay? Did you get authorization to pay for those damages beforehand? Is that what they told you to go in and do?
Generally speaking, what happens is one way or another, you pay for damages, and but it's not the taxpayer paying. The sailor's gonna pay.
Yeah. So
In fact, in
basically,
many places, that's just what they want. They want an apology, and
they,
they they want to be made whole.
yeah, apology and make it right.
And then we get the heck out of there because missing ships movement is a significant military issue.
Mhm.
Plus, being in a foreign jail is not necessarily a lot of fun either.
Yeah.
So so and it was just so bizarre and surreal. And so I get back to the ship in the afternoon, with the sailor, and I'm going, "What just happened? What was
Mm,
that?"
mm, mm.
But again, you had this great turnover. That I'm sure that courtroom is significantly different, but think of your British courtroom drama circa 1850, and this wood paneled courtroom with British barristers and mostly Chinese officials. And I guess the judge was kind of a hanging judge too. I learned later that she was really tough. Is when we got back via the embassy, and they went, "Oh, that turned out pretty well." But she's usually really, really tough.
Mhm.
It's like, okay.
So you basically paid for this, and then this guy, this soldier, he had to pay you back? That's
Well, not me personally, but we arranged for a payment,
got it.
and then there are many ways to dock someone's pay. So, but the person was very happy because jails in a lot of countries are not like jails around here.
No, they are not. Absolutely.
And from your experience, you might have observed that. So,
Yeah. Well, and it's funny that you say that because they're not, and they can be pretty brutal. But then you can be in places like Denmark where you're like, "Whew, I kind of would like to live in this jail in Denmark." So some countries
yeah.
have phenomenal systems like that. As we wrap this up, Per, just really appreciate you coming on and sharing all these stories. Lots of things that I never knew until we connected here. A lot of stuff our listeners just don't know about our own history as a country. In closing, just if you just share with us, what are you working on today? What's it look like today, and also how has your purpose and your future, how has that all really evolved since you've left the service? So what are you working on today, and what's life looking like for you now?
Well, I was an engineer and engineering duty officer, and but what I found was I really liked the engineering,
Mm,
but also like sort of the training and education part of it.
right.
And I didn't know I wanted kind of a clean break. I mean, there's lots of opportunity around the Navy and maintenance and advising and program management. But I actually went back to school, and eventually I went back to graduate school with my adult son, which was super interesting because we don't look a lot alike, and he was already living on his own. So we took a graduate quantum physics class together at UW, and we had to give presentations. And at the end of the quarter, and of course you have to do the formal. My name is, and people went, "Wait a second, you've got the same name as that other dude." And I went, "Yeah, he's my brother." And
You
they went,
called
"No."
him you called him your brother.
And they went, "No, get out of here. No, that's my son, Chris." But
Who did better in that class? Did you beat your son grade-wise, or did he beat you?
old age and treachery always beats youth and skill.
It's true, doesn't it? Plus, I mean, you were just locked in. I mean, when probably shouldn't be saying this, but when I went and got my bachelor's, I think I graduated like a 3.1 because I had a ton of fun. When I went to get my master's, that was a good old 4.0 because I was locked in.
What also matters who's paying, right?
It's true.
Well, anyway, I I was I was in the graduate program there at UW in physics. It's a night program.
Mhm.
That Boeing started, and it's sort of meant for Boeing employees and for people kind of coming back to school. It's not your traditional sort of PhD kind of run up. So
Sure.
it's in the master's, and I'm still technically in it because what happened? A job opened up at North Seattle College, and they put out the desperate, "Hey, we need someone to teach this class desperately." And I went, "Ugh, I'm already commuting from Tacoma or from Gig Harbor, Tacoma area up to Seattle. North Seattle is just too far. That's a long trip." And they sent out a second desperate plea. And what's tough about military things don't translate very well because we have our own jargon, our own description, and it's hard to understand what it means.
Mhm.
Well, what my son actually, Chris, actually said, "Why don't you look at that?" Because once you're in, you're in. Because one of the key things to teach as a professor is, have you been a instructor of record, a professor of record? Now, I had taught the labs at UW as a TA. I was alone in the class, but another professor was officially the professor. Was never there, but didn't have to be. But so I go in and interview that job, and they're so desperate. It's like, okay, the person doesn't have a third eyeball in the middle of their forehead. You're in. And only later did and it was like 2 weeks before the class was gonna start. Only later did I find out when I kinda asked politely, "Hey," and I asked the person in charge, the admin assistant, "Hey, why was this sort of so desperate?" "Oh, the person who was teaching this class died." "Oh, okay." But that checked the box, and I was gonna keep teaching there. I went on leave from the program because I was doing, well, like I said, what's always interested me is teaching. And then someone I worked at in the shipyard with, I knew his wife worked as a professor at Tacoma Community College, and I went and looked, and they have no jobs. And Tacoma Community College is 15 minutes, 20 minutes away from where I live.
Mhm. I mean,
Easy
if you're
commute.
if you're in if you're in Gig Harbor, there's even a chapter over there.
Yeah, and there's even, yeah, a local one here, but the main campus is in Tacoma.
That's right.
Yeah, there's a remote one just right up the road from me. Well, there's no jobs posted. But I do a little research, and I find that, one of the professors got his PhD in 1968. So I'm going, a little math from public. That dude's 80-something years old, unless he was like a savant or something. And so I call up, and it was Rebecca Sliger, who's this wonderful wonderful person, and
Mhm.
said, "Hey, I worked with your husband at the shipyard. Uh, there's no jobs posted, but you looking for someone to teach, like, engineering or physics or something like that?" And she goes, "Oh, yeah, desperately. We just haven't posted the job yet." So I went and interviewed, got the job.
Oh, that's
And
awesome.
I just about to leave there because it's time to retire again, but, taught there almost 10 years.
Mm, that's great. Per, it's been an absolute treat. Thank you so much for coming on The Wide Lens. Thank you for sharing all those stories. Thanks for sharing your perspective. Really enjoyed having you.
Thank you so much for having it. It's a very interesting podcast. It literally is the wide lens. If you look at the span of who you're interviewing.
Yeah, it's true, and also it's just fun to hear stories and perspectives that people never get to share. I mean, we will I know a guy who's a three-star general, and for that reason, he will not be on the podcast.
And now you know
That's
the
right.
four-legged mines are okay,
Yeah, exactly. That's the goats, right?
but look out for the three-legged ones.
Yeah. Thanks again, Per.
Bye bye.
That's a wrap on the Wide Lens podcast. If today's episode broadened your view of history, please follow, rate, and review us. It makes a real difference. A heartfelt thanks to our guests for their story and to Sergei Shadrin for providing the music. Know someone who's witnessed a pivotal moment? Drop us a line at ideas@widelenspodcast.com. Their story could be next. Until next time, keep looking at history through the wide lens.